Hi there everyone and welcome to this tutorial which is on reporting in an ASP MVC web application. So as you guys know, a report is something that basically gives an account of what has transpired, and in the case of an information system, it's basically an account or a statement generated based on what has happened in the system. So what data has been generated in the system, either through various transactions that have been processed or activities that users have performed on the system. So uh, to demonstrate a report, one obviously needs to have an existing system or some form of database from which you will report. So the easiest way I thought we could demonstrate this is to actually use one of Microsoft's sample databases. So Microsoft, in order to show its range of database tools, have made available free and open source sample databases. You can retrieve these sample databases from this URL. So they have a range of options here. They have wide world importers, and they've got AdventureWorks. For this tutorial, I've gone for the AdventureWorks sample database, and I've just gone ahead and clicked on the downloads for SQL Server 2014 and later. If you click on there, you've got it takes you to a GitHub repository, and you can just go and choose, depending on the version of SQL that you have, you can go and choose to download the appropriate buck file. So I went to go and click on the 2017 buck file, which will then go ahead and download. In your SQL Management Studio, you can see in my one, I've already imported that database. So how you would do that is you would simply go right click on databases, you click on restore database, you click on device and those three little dots there. And when you click add, then you can basically go ahead and choose a buck file, right? And if you click on that, then okay, then the database will be restored. So depending on where you downloaded your buck file, you can just go and find or navigate to that buck file, select it, and in such a way restore that database. And then you have the database in your SQL Management Studio. All right, so let's just quickly have a look at this database, and you'll notice that it's pretty large. So it's a really good database to just have a look at if you want to sort of learn uh, how to apply good practices in database design. It's a very good sample to use, but I will be using it obviously to demonstrate reporting. Okay, so we've got various subsections in the database. So you've got human resources, you've got person, you've got production, you've got purchasing, you've got sales. Okay, and in each of those subsections, you've got a range of different tables. Okay, so the data that exists in this database is what we will be using for our reporting. So let me just open up our application. So I've got this application already running, and why I've done that is to just show you what we're trying to head towards. So I want to show you in this uh, tutorial how to do an advanced report. I'm not going to demonstrate the simple report as in how to do it. I'll quickly show you what is included in the simple report. But what I'm going to show you practically is how to do an advanced report, with the hope that if you can do the advanced report, you'd be able to figure out the simple report yourself. So let's just quickly go to the simple report. The simple report is meant to show all the products where number of items on hand is less than or equal to the point at which that stock item should be ordered again. The purpose of such a report would be to inform a manager when they should be ordering any stock items in order to fill up those items, because if they don't know this information, then they might run out of stock and customers won't be able to buy these items anymore. All right. Now, this is an on-screen, very basic table, which is pulled from the database. As you can see, there's no criteria that can be filled in. It's a predefined report. And when I click on export as PDF, this report also downloads in PDF format, and it looks pretty similar to the report on screen. So sometimes managers just want to see reports on screen, and based on this go and take some form of action, or they would like to download it as PDF, maybe because they want to print it out, maybe it's because they want to store it on their local machine, or they want to distribute it among colleagues. Whatever the reason may be, sometimes reports are just to be viewed on screen, and sometimes it needs to be exported in some other format. And we would like to, or in this tutorial, I'll show you how to do both. I also have an export as Word, which looks exactly the same. It's obviously just in Word format. Okay. So that was a simple report, pretty straightforward and easy to do, but I'm going to be showing you the advanced report in this tutorial specifically. Now with the advanced report, there's already, you can see a difference. There is no report data that is immediately shown because it's not a predefined report. This report is based on some criteria that the user enters. So the purpose of this report is to show purchases that have been made at specific vendors. So orders we've placed at various suppliers. So the criteria that we have here is to say, okay, select a vendor. So these are all the different suppliers that Microsoft have put into that sample database. And then we've got a date range. If I click on generate here, it will return for the vendor Australia Bike Retailer, it will return all the various orders that were placed at that specific supplier. Now, the report is broken up in various sections. We've got a general section at the top, which just shows details of that vendor. So the account number of the vendor, the credit rating of that vendor, and whether that vendor is a preferred vendor or not. Then we've got a nice chart here that shows different internal employees in our company that were responsible for placing those orders. So Linda Meisner placed the lowest number of orders at that specific supplier, and Reinhard Hillman placed the most number of orders at that specific supplier. Then the third section is actually to show the details of individual orders, where it shows you the date of the order, the amount of the order, and the employee who placed that order. So in that period, that date range, there were only 4 orders, and you can see that the individual orders are grouped or broken up by control breaks, which we discussed in class. Now, a control break essentially groups report details into categories. So in this case, it's grouped by shipment method. So here we've got the cargo transport. There's 1 order placed under cargo transport, and we've got a running total here to add up the orders. In this case, there's only 1 order, but the other shipment method is overnight JFast. Okay, and in that specific period, the reporting period, we have 3 orders that use this specific shipment method, and as you can see, we've got a nice total here, and then we've got a grand total which adds the subsections together. So this 315 is added to the 1395 to come to your grand total. Okay, so this is your on-screen report. You can obviously style it better than what I have. This was just for demonstration purposes. Okay, and also we can export this as a PDF, where you've got your general details, your chart, and your grouped order details or individual orders, you'll notice that this PDF report doesn't look in terms of styling exactly the same as this one. It's got exactly the same data, but it doesn't have the same exact style. And the reason for that is this is an HTML report. You're bound by what you can do in HTML and in CSS, and whatever tools you use to generate this report. Whereas the PDF report, we generated using a particular tool called Crystal Reports, a particular plugin, which I'll show you just now. But it has its own limitations in terms of styling. But it's not a problem as long as the data, the information that is communicated is the same. And the layout and sequence of the report is more or less the same. The precise colors and styling doesn't make such a big difference. I'll also export it as Word. And you can see in Word it also generates a similar report. Okay, so this report is useful as it can show you in a specific reporting period for how many orders a particular supplier was used. So that can show the the amount of activity between yourself and a supplier, and also the amount of the relationship between a particular employee and a supplier, perhaps a particular employee's preference of a particular supplier, which can be useful for various business reasons. So that's nice. Now you guys know what we're trying to achieve. Let's jump into the Visual Studio project. I just want to run you through that. I'm going to stop it there. So firstly, we have a entity framework model which was generated from the database. Just a warning, I was required to modify that VentureWorks database slightly because entity framework doesn't deal with, you'll notice in the database there's data types called hierarchy IDs, and entity framework is not very comfortable with dealing that, so I've had to remove that where possible. The source code for this tutorial, as well as the modified database, will be made available on ClickUp. Just note that I've exported the database as a BUC file, but you will only be able to import that BUC file and thus run this project if you have SQL Server 17 installed. If you've got earlier versions of SQL Server, unfortunately the BUC file won't import to your SQL Server. All right, so with that being said, I've got only one controller, the home controller here. We have our views, one for index, which is the home page, and then we've got our simple report and our advanced report. As mentioned, we will not be discussing the simple report. Here's a quick look at it, but we won't be discussing it. You can have a look at it yourself if you have time. And also both the simple and the advanced view work through the home controller. And I have added lots of comments in here. So if you want to look at the simple report, you can just read through the code, and the comments should help you to understand that code. So I'm going to scroll all the way down to the advanced action methods. So the following actions are here to service the advanced report view. So this is the part we'll be looking at. All right, so let us look at the advanced view. So the first part to consider with the advanced view is that we want to accept criteria. We want the user to enter criteria that will limit the data that is taken into consideration for the report. So we've got essentially 3 input values that we require. The one is a drop-down list of vendors, because we want a specific vendor to be selected. So this report is specific to a vendor. And we want a reporting period to be provided, in other words, a date range. So we need a from date and a to date. Okay, let me take you to the advanced controller. So when the advanced view is first loaded, a GET request will be executed, which will then call this action. And you'll see that this action is pretty straightforward because we don't have to return any reporting data. We only have to return the basic data that is required to display the initial form. And the initial form basically consists of those three input fields. And the most complicated part of that is to actually get that drop-down list of vendors populated. So to do that, I've created another method called get vendors. Let me scroll down to that. Here we've got get vendors, and the purpose of the get vendors function is to build a collection of select list items. Because if you use this object select list item and you return that to the view, that is easily converted into a drop-down box, okay? Whereas other object types, you'll struggle on the view side to turn that into a drop-down box. I would recommend that you use this method. Okay, so we use a selected parameter. The selected parameter really comes in later once we've already selected a specific vendor. So I won't talk too much about this parameter now. I'll talk about it a little bit later. For now, it's very basic. We open a connection to the database, we select all of those vendors, and then we select a new select list item for each of the returned vendors. So we map the results that are returned from the database query into new objects of type select list item, and we create a list of that. Take a note of this syntax. We will use it quite often in this tutorial. It's basically allows you to not have to select the list of vendors with all its associated fields and attributes in the way that it sits in the database. You can essentially create a new object structure in this way. Okay, in this case, our selected parameter is 0. So we create a new select list, and that select list takes in this list of items. Is essentially a collection of key value pairs, and we basically specifying that the value is the value attribute should be used as the key, and the text attribute should be used as the value. Okay, don't worry too much about this, but just follow the structure and it will work for drop-down lists. All right, so then we return that to the view. If we go back to the view, we'll see that we use the @html.dropdownlist4 element. We use the view model advanced VM. Okay, so if we go to advanced VM, you'll see that we've got quite a complicated view model. For the first part of the view, entering of report criteria, we just need these few fields. Okay, so we've got the list of vendors, which is a collection of select list items, and we've got a datetime from and a datetime to, and then a selected vendor ID, which initially will be 0. Okay, so in this initial little form, we access the view models list of vendors, so that drop-down list is populated. Right, and then we've got two date fields, a from and to, which have default dates set here. Right. Okay, so that will essentially create this form where you've got your drop-down with your vendors and the dates. Okay, that's simple enough. Now we want to handle what happens when we click this generate button, when the form is submitted. So that part. Okay, so let's stop there. Let me take you through it. So initially, we've got this section of the form which says if model.vendor is not equal to null, then it will show this the stuff at the bottom of the page. So initially when the page is loaded, the vendor attribute of the view model is initially null, because we haven't gone to actually retrieve any vendor related data from the database apart from that list of vendors. Okay, so in the view model, this property is initially null, and while that property is null, none of the lower parts of the page will be displayed, just that initial criteria part. When we click the submit button, it goes to the home controller and actually calls the second action that is called advanced. In other words, this advanced method is overloaded. The one is a post and the other one is a get. So on initial load, this is the method that is called, and once the button is clicked, the generate button is clicked, then this post advanced method action method will be called, and here you can see the VM is actually passed into the method. All right, so what do we have to do here? So first, remember, we're going to return the view again, so we're going to go back to the same view, and in this instance, when we go back to that same view, we want to still have that list of vendors populated. We want to enable the user to select another vendor if they so wish, and for that reason, we need to get that list of vendors so that that drop-down list can still be populated. The difference here is now we have a selected vendor. So we pass through the ID of the currently selected vendor to the get vendors function, and all the vendors are selected once again, but in this case, we pre-select a particular vendor. So this clause of that if will be returned, will be processed, which means that when the advanced page is reloaded, the vendor that we selected will still be selected. Okay. Then we want to get the full details of the selected vendor, because we want to, on the report, display details of whichever vendor we selected. In the drop-down list, we can only see the name. Perhaps we want to show more details. So we use a simple database query, entity framework, Lambda query to get that vendor and load it into the vendor property of the view model. This property is of type vendor, so we just load it in there. Right, back to the controller. Now this is the tricky part, I guess, of this report, is to actually get the individual report details. So we want to get all supplier orders that meets the criteria that the user specified. We want to get all orders from the purchase order headers table. In order to figure out which specific table to use, you're going to have to go and look at the database structure a little bit. So in this database structure, there's purchase order header. If we go right click, select, you'll see that the purchase order header basically tells you individual orders that were placed at specific suppliers. So it tells you what the employee is that placed that order, at which vendor that order was placed, and what shipment method was used, and also the order date and the shipment date, as well as the order totals, subtotals, and so on. So this is the table we want to actually work with. The only way I figured that out was to look through the database a little bit, look at the data, and realize that that is the database table we need to query. So remember, we said DB configuration proxy creation enabled false. So because we don't want by default all the tables associated to purchase order headers to be included in the objects that are returned. We want to specify exactly which of those objects should be returned. So we only include the ship method item, and the reason for that is later on we want to create control breaks or groups that are specified according to those shipment methods. Okay, but then the important part is this where clause, where we basically apply the criteria. So first and foremost, each purchase order record, so each one of these must be true that the vendor ID, so the value in this column, must be equal to the primary key So if we go to the vendor table, purchasing.vendor, and we select that, you'll notice that the primary key is business entity ID. So we want to get the order where the vendor ID is equal to the business entity ID of the selected vendor, the vendor that the user selected. And we want to make sure that the order date of each and every order that is returned falls within that range that was specified. And that is what this clause, two clauses are for. Okay, then we return that as a list. And then from that list, we don't want to, this is an important part, we don't want to return the data in exactly this structure. Okay, so if you stopped there, you did not do this extra select, then the structure of the data that will be returned will be as such. It will have a business entity ID, account number, name, credit rating, preferred, etc., etc. We don't want it like that because that's not how we want to structure our report. So an important part that you need to consider when you're doing reports is it's one thing to query the data, but it's another thing to return the data that is queried in the appropriate structure so that it is easy to render the report. Okay, so we make use of the select method, which is a method that C# provides on any lists or any collections of objects. And we use the select method to create our own new structure. And that's a structure that is suitable for our report. Okay, so what I've gone to do is to create a new object, which is, you can call it a report model. Let's just go to the definition. We created a new object called report record, and this is a class that specifically structures or defines the structure for the records we want to see in our report. Okay, so we've got order date, amount, shipment method, employee, and vendor ID. And when we query it, we want to essentially map the purchase order headers that will come from this table into that report record structure. Okay, so we say select new report record, and then we fill for each report record, we fill the individual properties. So order date, we say, okay, this purchase order header has a order date. So we want to say the order date is equal to the order date of the relevant purchase order. The amount is equal to the total due value of the returned order. So if we look at this, there's a total due column, so it equals that. The ship method is equal to the purchase order dot ship method. That is why we had to include the ship method here. So each purchase order has a ship method ID, but we're going to include the ship method object. So if we just select there, this is how the ship method object looks, and we're going to include the name of that ship method object that is linked to the purchase order. Okay, and then we say the employee. Now with the employee, we want to select a specific type of object. We want to return the string of that employee that's linked up to that purchase order. So then we make another call to the database. There's probably other ways you can do this. You guys can figure it out. Database.people.where, because this database has an interesting structure. So if we look at the purchase order, there's an employee ID. Okay. Now the employee, if we go to the employee table, we go human resources.employee. The name and surname of the employee doesn't sit in this table. So what we can get from this is a business entity ID. Okay. Now to get the name and surname, we need to go to the person table. So there's a person.person table, and it also has a business entity ID. So we need to get the record in this table. So we need to get the first name and last name of the record in this table that matches up to the record in this table, um, which is an employee, which matches up to our purchase order that we found with our original query, which is here. Okay, so that's quite complicated, but that's just in normal databases that you guys would have, it wouldn't be this complicated. It's just because the structure of the database is um, very normalized, and that can sometimes have quite complex, result in quite complex queries such as this. So I go db.people.where, so we get all the person records where the business entity ID is equal to the employee ID of the purchase order. And what do I select out of that? I select the first name and the last name. Okay. And that result I load into the employee record. So now you can see the benefit of having this select in our query, because otherwise all of this logic would have had to happen on the front end with further calls to the controller, where now we just format the data directly in the structure that we want it to be in for the report, which makes the view logic far simpler. Okay, and then we say the vendor ID is equal to the purchase order dot vendor ID. That's pretty straightforward. Right, so now we've got a list of report records, so a list of objects of this type. Okay, and then now that we have the list, the way we want to display that list is through the use of control breaks. I'll show you a little bit later when we talk about the view, how exactly we want to use this. But in order to use control breaks, we need to group records into categories by a specific field. And this specific report shows all the records in groupings where the category is the actual shipment method. Okay, so we've got an individual group for each and every different ship method, and the records from this query is grouped into those categories. So how you do that is we take this list of report records and we group it by the ship method. All right, and that we load into the view models has a results field, and that results field is a list of I groupings. Now, why I use the I grouping type here is because lambdas dot group by method returns a I grouping data type. Okay, so that's why the results attribute is of that type. Okay, and then we also want to display a chart on the front end. Now, the chart is quite complicated, how to set it up, and I will show you exactly how you can use the Microsoft Charts helper to do this. Now, I'll get into the details of that just now, but what you should know now is that the Microsoft Charts helper requires its data, so the data that informs the chart, to be in a dictionary format. Now, a dictionary is essentially just a collection of key value pairs where Microsoft Charts will use the list of keys on the x-axis, and it will use the values of the dictionary for the y-axis. So we can set up this chart data and put it in our view model for now, so that later we can use it when we generate the chart. I'll show you how we use this data, but for now I just want to show you how we set up this data. So we say we again want to group, we want a grouping, and we want to take this list, and this time we want to group it by employee. Why do we want to group it by employee? Because our chart, the values on the x-axis are employee items. Okay, so we say dot group by employee, and this list of records, which is now grouped by employee, we want to convert to a dictionary. And to use this toDictionary function, we can take this grouping, we convert to a dictionary by specifying which of the values must be the key. Okay, so we can say the grouping dot key should be the key of the dictionary, and the grouping dot sum, where we say, okay, take each and every grouping of employees and sum the amount values within that grouping, and that becomes the y-axis value. Now, the other thing I want to explain to you is this concept of temp data. So the problem that we will have when we generate this report is that we can return this set of records back to the view, and that view can display the set of records in an HTML table with ease. Okay, but in order to generate a chart, we need to send data back to another action method so that the chart can be generated. Then we return the chart to the view, and that chart must then be rendered. In other words, we need to make two calls to the controller in order to generate the chart. The problem is, once we make a call back to this controller, this data, this chart data, is lost. So we can either make another call to the database, or we need to find some way to remember this chart data so that when a call is made back to the controller, we can recall this chart data and use this chart data to generate the chart. Now, that is exactly what temp data is for. Temp data is like a pocket of memory that you can put data into so that other controller actions can actually use the data. So data that you set up in one controller action can be used by another controller action. Okay, so we set the chart data into this temp data because the chart data will be used by this controller action, the employee orders chart controller action, which I'll discuss just now. And we also load our list into temp data because our list will be used by another controller action, which is responsible for generating the crystal reports. And finally, we also load the vendor data into this temporary pocket of data. So again, the reason we do this is to have our data to persist for more than just this one call to the controller. We want this data to be accessible for more than one calls to the controller. Okay, once we've done that, we're good to go and return the view and pass through the view model. Okay, so now if we go to the view, now again it will display this form, and the reason it displays it again is so that if the user decides they want to change their reporting criteria, they can do so and submit the form again. The difference here will be that the drop-down list will actually have a vendor selected already, courtesy of our get vendors function. Okay, now the big difference will be that in this case, the model.vendor will not be equal to null because we've actually gone to retrieve some data. So this first panel is pretty straightforward. It just shows the model.vendor dot some details. So we show the account number, we show the credit rating, and we show the preferred vendor status. Here we've got some unary if statement, just or shorthand if statement. So instead of showing 1 and 0, we show yes and no. Okay, you can just look at that, but this is a very basic panel. The next part that I want to show you is the chart data. Now, this is quite complex to work out. As I said, when we created this controller, we created this data structure to store the chart data. And when we get to this part, now we've got this chart data stored in temporary data back on the controller side. So how do we actually render the chart? Now, the way you have to do that is to actually make use of a Microsoft Charts helper. Okay, so there's this object in C# called a chart, and you need to create a new instance of a chart. Okay, so we could have, this is the code that essentially generates the chart. All right, but the problem is if we copy this code directly into the view, then the chart is the only thing that will show on the view, nothing else. None of our initial form, our vendor details, and everything else will show in the view, because this chart that will be generated by Microsoft Charts will just take over the entire view. So what we need to do is to load the result of that piece of code into an image. In order to do that, we need to go and create a partial view where that will run that piece of code. So in order to do that, you go right click, add, and you can go here, partial page. If you click that, then you create a new view, and this view can then be embedded in another view. All right, and that's what we're going to do here. So let me go through there. So this view takes as its model a dictionary. A dictionary is a set of key value pairs. So the key is a string. This will be employee name and surname, and the value items, the collection of values, is double, because this will be the amount, the sum of the orders processed by those individual employees. So that's the model. So this data should theoretically just come through here, and we can use that data then to configure the chart. So to create the chart, we just say var my chart or whatever equals new chart. We specify the width and the height that we want this chart to render as in pixels. We add a title for the chart, so supplier orders per employee, and then we add the series. So the name of the series is employees, and we've got X values, which we say model.keys. Remember, here we've got a dictionary. A dictionary consists of a collection of keys and a collection of values. So for the X axis, we say model.keys. For the Y axis, we say model.values. And then we simply say .write, and that then renders the chart. When we go back here, when this part is rendered, then a secondary call will be made to the controller, to the home controller, and this action will be executed. So if we go to the home controller and we go to that specific action, which is employee orders chart, this will execute, and then it will return the employees orders chart view that we just created. Okay, so then it will return this. But you'll notice that just before we actually return this view in the home controller, we first go ahead and access the chart data from that temporary pocket of data that we created when we initially processed the report criteria. So remember, we went here and we created a data structure specifically for the chart, and then we took that chart data and we put it in that temporary pocket of data. If we didn't use temp data here, we would not have been able to access this chart data again, and then we were going to be forced to make calls again to the database, which would be unnecessary processing. All right, so we recall that data from the temporary pocket of data and we send that through to the partial view as its own view model. Okay, and then when you come here, that chart data is then this dictionary that gets pulled in here, and that chart data is then used to populate the chart. Cool. Then what will then happen is this chart will be rendered and it will be loaded as an image on the bigger report advanced report view. Okay, so now the third panel is there to show the individual supplier order records, but it shows it with control breaks. Now, control breaks are, like I said, groupings of orders. So instead of having one big table with all the records that are returned, we now group these records according to certain dimensions. In this case, we've grouped it according to shipment method. Okay. How you then go about it, because remember on our controller side, we organize the data. So vm.results is the data we want to show, and we've grouped it by ship method. Okay, now this results is of type list of I groupings. So how do we then iterate through that? We say for each group in model.results, we display the group.key. Okay, so each group will then be each individual shipment method type. Okay, so then we display the type of shipment method. All right, and then for each of those groups, we create its own table. We create a row with headers, and then we have a nested for that. For each of the groups, we want to loop through each of the records, report records within that particular group. So you'll see there's a for within a for here. Okay, so then we say for each group item in group, we already know that each item in that group is of type report record because we created this list of records, so we know what the type is. And then for each of those group items, we create a row, and in that row, we've got the order date, the amount, and the employee, which will be the first name and last name of the employee. Just note that we've used this formatting in order to get it in our currency. For each of the groups, so for each of the shipment methods, we add an extra row at the end after we've iterated through each of the items within that group in order to create a total column. So let's say we've got 3 items within a particular group. We then want to add up those 3 items so that we have a total in the last row of that table, the table that's associated with that particular shipment method. Then we say, okay, we out of the inner for loop now, but we're still within the outer for loop. So this group is still applicable. Then we say, okay, so let's load in our second cell of the table the group dot sum of the amount of this item. So we essentially use the dot sum lambda method to sum all the group items within the group together and create a total value. And this is then how you create a nice control break in your report. Now with control breaks, if you've got various control breaks in a report, each with their own subtotals, it's always important to have a grand total. So here at the end, we create H3, which to just let it stand out a bit. And we say, okay, the grand total is equal to model.results. So these are all the groupings put together. We take the sum of each and every group. Okay, so that's a sum within a sum. So we take group.sum, creates a subtotal for each of the groups, and we sum together all those subtotals to create the grand total. Just familiarize yourself with this. Right, and once we've done that, then we actually have our on-screen report. So just to recap, we selected our three items here. When we click generate, it sent this criteria through to the advanced action method. The advanced action method went to retrieve vendor details, put it in the view model. It created chart data, which it stored in the temporary data pocket of data, which when we got to this view, we made a secondary call to the employee chart controller, which is the controller action associated with the partial view that we created to render this chart. That controller action went to fetch data from the temporary data and sent it through to the partial view. The partial view used that data to render the report. The result of that partial view was then embedded as an image in this view. And here we have our control breaks. So here we've got one grouping and we've got a second grouping. Each of those grouping has its own subtotal, and the subtotals add up to the grand total. Right. So that is your on-screen report, and when you go ahead and change your selection and you generate it again, the report updates accordingly. But now some managers don't just want to see an on-screen report, they maybe want to export or download the report in a PDF format or Word format. And I want to show you in this tutorial also how you go about doing that. All right, so specifically for the purposes of downloading or exporting reports in offline formats such as PDF or Word, I want to introduce you to a tool called Crystal Reports. Okay, now if you go to this website or to this URL, this link, you can actually go and download Crystal Reports. So Crystal Reports is a plugin for C#. So it's a C# library that you can install in order to design reports and link certain reports up to data sources. Okay, so then you don't have to go and create sort of PDF files and Word files from scratch. This plugin creates it for you. So you just fill in at this SAP web page, you fill in your details. It's a free download. It will download an installer. You run the installer, and then when you restart your Visual Studio, you will be able to create Crystal Reports. So what I've done in this project is I've created a folder for reports in which I've got my actual Crystal reports. So you'll see I've got criticalstock.rpt, which is my simple report. And for this advanced report, I've got my vendor sales.rpt. Okay, so let me just quickly show you. I've already created the reports in this project, but I want to actually show you how you would go about creating a report. So you go right click on your reports folder, add, new item. Once you've installed Crystal Reports, you should have an option here for reporting, and there you have Crystal Report. Okay, so you just click on that. If you haven't installed Crystal Reports, you haven't gone to that website and downloaded it and installed it and restarted your Visual Studio, then this option won't be available for you. So then I'm just going to create a report called demo, just so that I can show you how it looks. And initially, when you create a report, it asks you, do you want to use a reporting wizard? And they have some reporting templates and so forth. So I just normally say as a blank report. And if you click a blank report, you just go OK. And then it basically opens up this report designer screen. Okay, so view this as a page, and the page has various sections, and you can then pull into this page reporting elements. Okay, so you can design your report. When you open Toolbox and you open Crystal Reports, you've got various options here. I normally don't work with the Toolbox. I just go right click, insert, and you can insert a variety of things here. So You can, for example, go insert text object, you place your text object wherever you want. Then you've got some report title. Okay, you can click on it, you can make it wide. You can, if you click on an element, you'll see items here within your Visual Studio that you wouldn't normally see, which you can use to increase the size of the text and whatnot, depending on what item you've clicked on. Just make sure it actually fits in. Okay, so that's a very basic, that's just a static text element. On your right hand side here, you'll see your field explorer. Um, it might not be positioned exactly here, but just you'll find it somewhere in your Visual Studio if you've added a Crystal report. And in your field explorer, you've got a bunch of variable fields that you can actually pull into your report. Now, the key thing with a report is it's typically linked up with some sort of data source. So a report is useless if it's not dynamic in terms of the data it is connected to. The data should be pulled from some sort of data source, and then the report is generated based off of that data. So the purpose of this designer is to define the layout and structure of the report, and then pull in variable aspects. And the report, once it renders, should adapt itself according to those variable elements you pull in. What I want to show you now is how you actually go and link this report to data. Okay, so you would typically go and click on Database Expert. Once you do that, it opens this wizard, and you can go and select database elements that you can pull into the report. So I can theoretically link my report directly with my database, and it can then directly from your database generate reports. However, I do not want to do that because I've got custom formats for my report. I almost want to take data from the database, restructure it into a format that I like, into a format that's more in alignment with my reporting needs, and then link my report to that structure. So the next thing I want to actually show you is a data set. I want to be able to set up customized data sets and then link the Crystal report up to that custom data set. So just again for demo purposes, so I've got for my other reports, I've already created custom data sets. So for my advanced report, I've got a data set. In that data set, I've got a vendor table, and I've got vendor sales table. So vendor contains the detail of the selected vendor, and vendor sales contains the details of all the individual orders that I've placed with that specific vendor. Okay. Once I've created this data set, it allows me to link this data set up with a Crystal report, and based on that structure of the data set, you can then define a layout, define formulas, define variables, whatever you would like to do. Okay, so how do you go ahead and create this data set? So you would go right click. I just normally house it in the report itself. So you can almost, this data set, I typically refer to it as my report models. So I right click, add, new item, click on data. There's an element called data set. So data set allows you to create custom data structures for your own specific needs. It's not always just for reporting, but we're using it for reporting. So I'm going to create a custom data set called demo. And just for demonstrative purposes, so essentially a data set is a collection of tables. Think of it as an in-memory database. So it looks exactly like a database. It's just that it's in memory, and when the program stops running, that data doesn't exist anymore. Okay, so you can add data tables to your data set. So let's call it student. All right, and we add a column. We can make an ID. If you click on the ID, you can go down here to your properties, and you can select the data type, and let's just add one more column. We call it name, and the data type is string. Okay, so now that this is your data set, if you save this and you go back to your demo report and you go to your database expert. Okay, so here I've got my sometimes the data set doesn't pull through immediately and you have to refresh a few times, sometimes run and stop and restart your project. Worst case scenario, close Visual Studio and open it again. But eventually, if you refresh it, your data set, your demo data set that you created should be visible under the addo.net data sets. If you open that up and you click on one of your data tables that you've created, you can go ahead and add that to your selected tables. And once you say OK, that then becomes a table that has variables, and you can then pull those variables into your report. Your ID and your name. And if you do that, then it automatically creates headers for ID and name. And if you just put a preview here, it just creates random data. Crystal Reports does this for you. But this then would say, so if you had in your data set these IDs and these names, then this is how your report would come out. So that should give you an idea of how you can design Crystal Reports. There's a lot of different things you can do with Crystal Reports. I don't have time in this tutorial to show you everything, but you are welcome to go and Google, as there's a lot of support available online for it. So this was just a test report, which we not really going to use. I just wanted to show you how to create an actual Crystal report and how to create a data set and how to link that Crystal report to the actual data set. So how this advanced looks is we've got we created two tables. So let me just, we created a data set called vendor sales. Vendor orders would have probably been a better name, but we've got a table for vendor, and that's to store the details of the selected vendor, um, so that we can actually use that vendor table with the name, credit, and preferred, and pull that into the report over here. Um, then the important table in our data set is our vendor sales table, and that we will actually use to create our order details here. So we simply pulled these values in here. We created a new group name, okay? And when we create a new group, you can go insert group. You can specify what attribute the data will be grouped by. And once you've done that, then the report automatically will group data according to those elements. Okay, again, please just go and play around with this. This is a very generic tool, and there's millions of things you can do with it. It's infinite, and it's impossible in one tutorial to show you everything. But essentially, you can pull in these values, and you can create a group, pull in the group, and if you pull in the group, it will display the items with those control breaks. In this case, we created a group for the shipment method. So we've got one group that we have for shipment method already created. And that then allows us to group our orders by shipment method, just as we did on screen. We can also add formula fields. We created a conditional formula here so that we can display the preferred status, which the actual value in the database is true or false. And this formula then allows us to, here you can see if the vendor.preferred is true, then we display it as yes, else we display it as no. So this is just a conditional formula. You can apply some condition to the value of the data, and based on that, change your display. We also have running total fields in order to create the subtotals as well as the grand total. So you would go right click, insert summary, and then you can go and select what do we want to summarize. You can go and select amount, and then you can go and select this aggregation, so a formula. In this case we selected sum, and then we say summary location, and we can either do a grand total or the entire the grand total, which is everything, or a specific group, which will then place it in the grouping section. The last thing I want to show you is just how to create this chart. So you would go right click, insert chart. It will tell you, you can then move around and actually go and select where you want to place the chart. And once you've inserted the chart, it will open Chart Expert for you. And that will allow you to select the data of the chart, the type of the chart, which you've got a whole collection here, and what displays on what axis, and you can really customize your chart here. So in this case, we've got employee on the x-axis, and we've got the sum of vendor sales dot amount on the y-axis, which is the same as we have it in our on-screen report. And if we preview that report, then it shows it like this. How do we then actually, now we've got this report, but this report stands in isolation, our C# code needs to actually call up this report, create this report, and then download it as a PDF or as a Word file. Okay, so let me go to our view. Right at the bottom, we've got two action links here, export as PDF and export as Word. Each of these calls specific controller actions in the home controller. So when I click on this export as PDF link, it will go to the home controller and it will hit this export advanced PDF method. All right. So first thing you do in your C# is you create this report document object, which comes from the Crystal Reports library. Then we first have to say, okay, what's specific, because we can obviously create multiple different Crystal Report designs. Here we've got test report, vendor sales report, critical stock report, whatever. So in this case, we want to select or load the vendor sales report. So we specify the path to that report so that it loads the appropriate Crystal report. Then we want to set the data source for that Crystal report. Now the data source we specify needs to be the same as the data source we initially set that Crystal report up with. So in the instance of vendor sales, we created the vendor sales data set, and therefore the type of data source we set here in our home controller needs to be a vendor sales model. It needs to look like this. Okay, so in our code, we need to populate a structure like this and link it up to our report. So that's why when I say report.set data source, we actually call a method. It says get advanced data set. So that's a method that specifically aims to create a vendor sales model. In other words, to create this data set and link it up with our crystal report. Okay, so in this method, we create a new instance of our data set. So this is our data set. We create a new instance of this, which will initially be empty. Okay, then we need to go and populate that data set with data. Now remember, when we initially sent through our call to the advanced controller, we loaded data into the temporary pocket of data, just like we did with the chart. We now need to use that temporary data pocket to actually load data into our custom data set so that the custom data set can inform the crystal report with the appropriate data so that the report is rendered properly. Okay, so as I've said, or as I've shown you, there's two tables, one for vendor and one for vendor sales. So the selected vendor's details needs to be stored in here. So we need to load one record of the selected vendor into this vendor table. Okay, so that's what we do. We create a new data row. So we say data row v row equals data.vendor.new row. So data is the data set. The data set has a table called vendor. So we go data.vendor.new row. Now this new row we need to populate with data. That data we get from that temporary data pocket. And then we say vrow.id equals vendor.businessEntityID, vrow name equals vendor.name, vrow credit equals vendor.credit rating, and so forth. And then we go data.vendor.rows.add. So this data.vendor.new row simply creates a template for a new row. Then we need to populate that new row. Then we go ahead and actually add that new row to the data set. Okay, so now we've added the vendor to the data set. Then we have to go ahead and add the individual records. Temp data records equals list.toList. So this is just our purchase orders. So our purchase order records that came back from our database query when we initially submitted the criteria get stored in the temporary data. Now from that temporary data, we call that back up and we iterate through that to create a new record for each and every item in this vendor sales table. Once we've done that, we have a complete data set with a vendor and associated orders from that vendor. Okay. Then what we have to go and do, because this temporary data pocket only survives a single call. So if you load data into that temporary data, at the second call to a controller action, that after that second call, the data expires. If you want that data to last for another call, you have to go and reset it. So here we simply go and say the data that was in this pocket set into that again. Okay, it's a weird way of doing it, but that's how it works with MVC. Okay, and then we return that data. So the data type that is returned is that data set. So remember, we called that from our set data source. So now we've gone ahead and set our report, our crystal reports data source to that data set that we populated. Then we have to simply go and configure the response type. So you guys can just follow this. Then we have to go and write our report. So now we've got our report. We've chosen the design of report. We've set the data source for the report. That report now needs to be written into an appropriate stream. And it is with this report.export to stream where we specify that we want to export it as PDF. Okay, a stream has a cursor, and after we've written to that stream, we want to go and set the cursor back to the beginning of that stream, and then we return the file, which will then download your PDF report. We do exactly the same thing for our Word. The only difference is that our export type will be different. Okay, and there you have it. This was a long tutorial because there's a lot of aspects that you have to consider when you design reports and when you generate those reports through your C# code. If you don't understand everything directly after watching this tutorial, it's not a train smash. You can always refer back to this tutorial. The main goal is to guide you as you practice yourself to do these things. Here we have our report, our on-screen report, and our PDF that downloads, as well as our Word. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope it helps. See you next time.